Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Praxis, Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia by Gerson S. Sher. Chapter 4 is titled The Critique of Yugoslav Socialism. Quote, "The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated men, and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan. This, however, demands for a society a certain material groundwork or set of conditions of existence, which in their turn are the spontaneous product of a long and painful process of development." Marx, Capital, Volume 1. One second. Okay. The idea of self-management. First section, the idea of self-management. The idea of the free association, of producers is as old as socialism itself. Owen, Proudhon, Fourier, and others, those forerunners and contemporaries of Marx whom he contemptuously dubbed, quote, utopian socialists, end quote, all dreamed of a society in which production and exchange would take place in an atmosphere free of external compulsion, greed, and misery. Marx inherited this aspiration, but warned that its realization was far from imminent and that it was predicated, as Marx asserted in the above quoted passage from Capital, on material conditions that must themselves be the, quote, spontaneous product of a long and painful process of development, end quote. As if to emphasize the point in his writings, he devoted nearly all his attention to that very process of development, giving little indication of what the new forms of association might look like when they finally appeared. Only in one historical instance, the Paris Commune, did Marx recognize anything even remotely resembling what he called the, quote, self-government of the producers, end quote. The political and administrative structure of the Commune represented for Marx the thorough realization of the democracy of which he had written nearly 30 years earlier in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The popularization of the armed forces, the establishment of universal suffrage and rotation of delegates, the provisions for strict accountability and the merging of executive and legislative functions, and perhaps most importantly, the provision that public servants receive no more compensation than an ordinary worker's wage, all were received by Marx with the highest praise. While the Commune did not provide directly for democracy in the sphere of production, Marx seemed to think that something on this order was imminent in the nature of the Commune. Quote, "Its true secret," end quote, Marx wrote in the Civil War in France, was that it, quote, was essentially a working class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating classes, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor, end quote. Indeed, without this last condition, he stressed, the entire formal political structure of the Commune, quote, would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The political rule of the producer cannot coexist with the perpetuation of his social slavery. The Commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economical foundations upon which rests the existence of classes, and therefore of class rule. With labor emancipated, every man becomes a working man, and productive labor ceases to be a class attribute. End quote. Marx. The Civil War in France. With the death of the Commune, the idea of the, quote, self-government of the producers, end quote, was adopted by radical syndicalists who insisted that the organization of production should be carried out directly by the workers through their trade associations. It was more or less in this form that the idea surfaced in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s in the famous intra-party debate over the, quote, workers' opposition. The workers' opposition, Kollontai asserted, quote, supports the thesis that the management of the economy is the affair of the trade unions, and in this its thinking is more, quote, Marxist than that of the theoretically schooled party summits. The leading economic organ in the Workers' Republic must, in the present transitional period, be an organ elected by the producers, the workers. All other Soviet apparata which act in the area of production and the economy only carry out the economic policy of that main economic organ of the Workers' Republic. End quote. Kollontai. It is significant for subsequent Soviet history that these ideas about workers' councils developed out of the growing mistrust of party activists of an increasingly ponderous central bureaucracy. To be sure, their suspicions were not unfounded, but Lenin, in his rejoinder to the workers' opposition, refused to confuse what he perceived as two distinct issues. The struggle against bureaucratism would proceed with ever greater vigor, Lenin insisted at the 10th Party Congress, while the trade unions would function as, quote, schools of communism, end quote. As for direct management of the economy by the workers, however, Lenin dismissed the idea for the time being as a luxury which the party, at a time when the country was in the grip of serious threats from abroad and continual crises from within, not to mention the still relatively uneducated state of the Russian working class itself, could ill afford. The issue was closed for the foreseeable future. Thus, when Tito boldly proclaimed the introduction of worker self-management in Yugoslavia on June 26, 1950, this small country was embarking on a largely uncharted course. Conditions in Yugoslavia in the early 1930s were hardly more favorable than they had been in Russia 3 decades before. Yugoslavia was still a backward country with a rather small industrial base. It had recently suffered through a costly war in which it lost a greater proportion of its population than any other European country, including the USSR. It was under severe external pressure, both military and economic, from all sides, and it had just experienced the trauma of estrangement from the Soviet Union, which itself was the cause of serious internal conflicts throughout the Yugoslav party. With all this in mind, Tito's daring and imagination seem all the more remarkable in retrospect. The proclamation of worker self-management was designed precisely to mobilize and unify the population in the face of these serious strains, internal and external. In addition, worker self-management was intended to lay the groundwork for a far-reaching social transformation by cultivating the awareness of the broad working populace of its right to control the processes and products of its labor, while simultaneously struggling against the evils of bureaucratism. And to root out bureaucratism meant no less than to strike at the very foundations of the Stalinist political order, many of whose features were closely replicated in Yugoslavia in the immediate post-war years. In his speech announcing the self-management reform, Tito clarified the purposes of the experiment. Quote, the transfer of the factories and mines, etc., to management by workers' collectives will prevent the infectious disease known as bureaucracy from becoming endemic in our economy. Bureaucracy is among the greatest enemies of socialism for the reason that it is drawn in unnoticed at every pore of social activity without people being aware of it at first. It is imperative that we enlist the assistance of the broadest masses to fight against it and not allow this menace to socialism to get underway. End quote. Josip Broz Tito, excerpt from his speech on the 26th of June 1950. The introduction of worker self-management in Yugoslavia can be described without exaggeration as a revolutionary departure. Still, this was a revolution from above. In pre-revolutionary Russia, for example, the movement for factory control seems to have been at first the result of the spontaneous actions of Petrograd workers, only later embraced by the Bolsheviks and then only temporarily, while in Poland and Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, demands for workers' councils came from below with dissident intellectuals acting as catalysts. In Yugoslavia, in contrast, worker self-management appeared as the result of a political decision made at the highest levels and quickly became an integral part of the established system. As a plaque on a Yugoslav factory building reads, quote, "The party state leadership gave the factories to the management of workers' collectives," end quote. These circumstances would have important implications for the subsequent development of the Yugoslav model of worker self-management. While it was originally applied only to factories and similar industrial enterprises, the principle of self-management was by the mid-1950s broadened to apply to other social sectors as well, eventually embracing social self-government, services and consumption, communal self-government on the basis of territorial political units, and on a much more restricted scale, rural self-management. Footnote: one of the most informative studies on the structure and development of self-management in Yugoslavia is some book in French by Albert Meister, Où va l'état Yougoslav? See also Jiri Kolaya's book, Workers' Councils, The Yugoslav Experiment, published in 1965. See Adolf Sturmhall's book, Workers' Councils, published in 1964. Johnson claims that the original theoretical inspiration for the self-management experiment came from Cardell's seminal 1949 article in the journal Communist, number 4. And footnote. The functions assigned to the units of self-management, as well as the degree of autonomy of those units from external control, varied over time but grew steadily throughout the subsequent decade. There is no question that by the mid-1960s, the role of these self-management collectives in the national economy as a whole was significant, but as Albert Meister suggests, their net social and economic impact was still rather difficult to assess. Quote, "Since their introduction, the effects of the workers' councils and of their new liberty have made themselves felt in the following areas: struggle against waste, increased productivity, reduction of manpower. These positive effects, however, have been counterbalanced, true to a lesser degree, by negative tendencies, the economism of enterprise, a lack of morality in market behavior, excessive abuse of personnel, and an excessive degree of individual profit sharing to the detriment of productive investments and the social or collective utilization of profits." End quote. Albert Meister. At the same time, and perhaps precisely because of these difficulties, the regime sought to confine the principle of self-management as much as possible to the lower levels of the political and economic system. Basic decisions about national investment policy have been handled not by organs of self-management in the productive sectors of the economy, but either by central federal organs or more recently by banks and other commercial concerns. Indeed, this and related problems, as we shall see below, is one of the major weak links which many Praxis Marxists have found in the practice of self-management in Yugoslavia. But for the time being, it is important to observe that insofar as self-management is a working part of the Yugoslav political system as a whole, it is subject to the same pressures toward idealization and rationalization as well as all social ideas which lend their support to the formal political structure of a society and its perpetuation. In short, self-management, too, has had a sort of ideology constructed around it. Along with this, there has developed an implicit but mandatory pecking order of criticism. Meister writes, quote, "Before, criticism, is expressed by the chief or major leaders, the institutions and their functioning are not presumed to be subject to criticism. One closes one's eyes to that which is not going well. One maintains silence about the evidence. Officially, the institutions are the best and most democratic, but the people have had since the beginning of their history, ... But later criticism appears. The chief speaks, and immediately everyone speaks, criticizes, and even demolishes." End quote. Meister. Albert Meister, or Albert Meister is probably actually said. It does not seem overly exaggerated to say that Meister's observations have generally held true, with but one significant exception: the Marxists of the journal Praxis. In this context, Stoyanovich provides a valuable supplement to Meister when he writes that, quote, "After an official acknowledgement of the existence of deformation, and quote, previously criticized independently by intellectuals, quote, it is the critics of these phenomena who are expelled from the party rather than those who are really responsible, end quote. Stoyanovich. Indeed, in their critique of worker self-management in Yugoslavia, the Praxis Marxists often failed to conform to this protocol of criticism, and perhaps this above all was their most serious offense. For this reason, it is all the more important to emphasize that both within Yugoslavia and on the international scene, there have been no better or more persuasive spokesman for the principle of worker self-management than the Praxis Marxists, precisely perhaps because of their critical stance. To be sure, official opponents of the Praxis Marxists have been loath to concede this point. At international symposia and lectures abroad, in translations of their works, and through the vehicle of the Korčula Summer School, and finally through Praxis itself, these intellectuals, of whose broad international reputation Tito himself has spoken publicly with much suspicion, have eloquently and forcefully spoken on behalf of workers' self-management as the sole form of social organization capable of resolving contradictions inherent in both bourgeois and existing socialist societies, and is most consonant with Marx's vision of a, quote, free association, EO, of producers, end quote. Footnote. Of particular note in this connection was Rudy Supek's participation in the International Symposium in Amsterdam in 1970 dedicated to worker self-management in Yugoslavia. Papers in ensuing discussion at the symposium are compiled in M.J. Brockmeyer's edited volume, Yugoslav Workers' Self-Management. See also Josip Broz Tito. We shall defend our socialist community with all available means, concluding remarks by President Tito at the 21st session of the Presidency of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Published in Socialist Thought and Practice, number 45, October-December 1971. End footnote. Footnote. In this connection, W.N. Dunn has rightly observed that the, quote, socialist humanists are the only ideological group in contemporary Yugoslavia which maintains a commitment to cultural goals of self-management, end quote. See W.N. Dunn's article, Ideology and Organization in Socialist Yugoslavia, Modernization and the Obsolescence of Praxis. Published in Newsletter on Comparative Study of Communism, Volume 5, Number 4, August 1972. Markovich's enthusiasm for the principle of self-management is representative of that of his colleagues. Quote, 8 decades after the Paris Commune and Marx's analysis of its experience, says the socialist movement rediscovered the forgotten principle of self-management. In so doing, it returned to its soul, its profound human value, and its universal historical character at a time when it had seemed that its hour had passed in the West. For only democratic socialism, more significantly a society of self-management, signifies a radical negation of modern capitalism and its ultimate radical humanization, and accordingly the necessary path of the further development of incipient transitional forms of post-capitalist society. End quote. Mihailo Markovich. Markovich's colleague, Ljubomir Tadic, expresses a similar conviction. Quote, I see the essence of self-management as immediate democracy, as primarily the real possibility of submitting necessary public functions to the effective and public control and critique of the mass of workers, radically excluding... Something jumped up on my computer. I see the essence of self-management, Jesus Christ, quote, and this is Ljubomir Tadic. I see the essence of self-management as immediate democracy, as primarily the real possibility of submitting necessary public functions to the effective and public control and critique of the mass of workers, radically excluding professional functionaries and their privileges, since every parasitic form is alien to socialism. End quote. Tadic. The Praxis Marxists have been careful, however, to distinguish between self-management as an immanent principle and self-management as an existing reality. They have consistently reaffirmed the appropriation and control by the producers of the means of production as the most worthy goal of a truly socialist society. But they have also shared a conviction that without a frank critical Marxist evaluation, whatever its conclusions, of the practice of self-management in Yugoslavia, the revolutionary principle of self-organization would represent nothing more than an empty ideological justification for a new system of class oppression. New section, self-management between bureaucratism and economism. As Yugoslav society underwent dramatic changes in the decade from 1965 to 1975, and especially since the effects of the economic and political reforms of the mid-1960s came to be felt, the emphasis of the Praxis critique of Yugoslav self-management tended to shift accordingly. In general, the Praxis Marxists have seen embryonic and fragile forms of self-management as threatened by the twin dangers of bureaucratism and market-induced atomization, by too much integration and paradoxically too little. But over time, the Praxis Marxists tended to exhibit increasing concern with problems of excessive decentralization and the rise of a new bourgeoisie, which in their view were simply superimposed over the more long-standing legacy of bureaucratic domination. Above all, it was the very dynamism of the Praxis critique, with its internal roots in a humanistic philosophy of man, that prevented it from fixating on any single dimension of self-management, and that in fact contributed to the critique's ability to anticipate problems, such as the localization of economic conflict and the degeneration of the self-managing organization into a political subordinate of the technocratic infrastructure, that were only later grasped, and even then not in their entirety, by those in authority. In the first major Praxis article devoted to a critical evaluation of self-management in Yugoslavia, Mihailo Markovic stressed a basic discontinuity in the structure of the Yugoslav political system. While the principle of worker self-management had been introduced a decade and a half before, in its actual implementation, self-management turned out to be an institution existing only alongside of the state rather than in place of it, an institution, furthermore, quote, which embraces only local organs of social power, end quote. At higher levels of the political structure reigned the bureaucratic principle, effectively curbing democratic tendencies in the base while exerting real power where important social decisions were at issue. This situation led Markovic to assert, quote, self-management cannot be reduced to its initial historical forms which at present exist in our country, ... It cannot be limited only to production relations at the level of the enterprise and to the local organs of social power. The complete and definitive surpassing of bureaucracy is possible only when self-management reaches the top, when the central organs of the state are converted into organs of self-management. Markovic, Socialism and Self-Management. At the same time, Markovic suggested that this bipolar model of Yugoslav society was oversimplified to the extent that it overlooked the formation of bureaucratic cliques at the local enterprise level, composed of party, technical management, trade union, governmental, and even workers' council leaders, who by virtue of their position in the hierarchy wield the balance of power in both the commune and the enterprise, and who use the power to gain substantial personal benefits. The existence of such oligarchic cliques and their negative influence on the level of workers' formal participation in and their information about decisions at the enterprise level have been amply documented by sociological investigations. Studies from 1960 to 1969 by the Ljubljana, I don't know how to say that place, sociologist Veliko Rus, confirm the relative lack of opportunity for worker participation in the decision-making process and the consequent alienation of the workers from the institutional structure of self-management. Footnote. Russ, a close associate of Praxis for many years and a member of its editorial council throughout its history, nevertheless remains somewhat aloof from the journal's fundamental ideas, as the following discussion will suggest. In some article in, some language, Russ presents a summary of the 1960 to 64 findings of the Kron Institute for Labor Organization and the Serbian Republic Center for Worker Self-Management in Belgrade on the hierarchical structure of industrial enterprises. Subsequent studies of interest in this connection done by Russ are something, blah, 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 end footnote. All of this seemed to indicate a basic lack of progress since at least 1964, when Russ reported to a session of the Korčula Summer School, quote, "Sociological analyses bear witness to the fact that the structure of power within workers' organizations, in spite of structural changes, have remained essentially the same. In spite of the significant degree of decentralization of competence, we find that the influence of the central organs of the enterprise is still predominant. In spite of the fact that the collegium is formally only an advisory organ of the director, we find that this organ has a dominant role in workers' organizations. These findings can be generalized with a great degree of certainty, but this means that all the previous structural changes have not sufficed to guarantee a fundamental democratization within workers' organizations." End quote. In order to appreciate the significance of these assertions, it may be useful to sketch a broader picture of the relationship between participatory democracy and self-management as perceived in Praxis theory. In what was probably his most important essay on the problem of self-management, Supek indicates that the goal of self-management is no less than the transcendence of the alienation of the producer by overcoming the harmful aspects of the division of labor, which have been responsible for antagonistic class divisions in all previously existing societies, save the most primitive. In this connection, both Supek and his Zagreb colleague, Ivan Kovacic, have been convinced that the automation of production will contribute significantly toward a reintegration of the technical aspects of the productive process and an attenuation of the distinctions between labor and managerial functions, in addition to generating free time for the pursuit of cultural values. Footnote. Supek and Kovacic have pointed out that while Marx viewed the development of technology as an alienating force within the capitalist system of production, Marx envisioned it as an emancipatory force once freed from the shackles of competition and private property. Indeed, Marx wrote the following of automated production, quote, "Labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as a watchman and a regulator to the production process itself, ... No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing as middle link between the object and himself. Rather, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power, his understanding of nature and his mastery over it by virtue of his presence as a social body. It is, in a word, the development of the social individual, which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time on which the present wealth is based appears as a miserable foundation in face of this new one, created by large-scale industry itself." End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. End footnote. To be sure, their technological optimism has been tempered with caution. They are aware that the integration of technical functions will not necessarily contribute to the de-alienation of labor from the standpoint of the individual producer, nor will it automatically extend to spheres of social activity outside of the enterprise. Indeed, beyond the goal of control by the producers over their immediate productive activity, Supek has described the primary function of self-management as the, quote, integration of the productive community into the civil community, end quote. By giving the workers experience in the art of self-government during their labor time while extending the boundaries and competences of the self-managing collective beyond activities immediately associated with material production to include educational, social, and cultural activities as well. Thus, the importance of worker participation in self-management lies in more than the immediate satisfaction of what may be derived from such participation. Participation in the decisions of the enterprise should serve as a base for the simultaneous mastery of the productive process, the integration of political and economic functions, and the complete development and humanization of the individual personality. Considering the central importance attributed to the concept of participatory democracy in Praxis theory, Veljko Rus's 1970 Praxis essay entitled Self-Management, Egalitarianism, and Social Differentiation seemed to indicate a clear intellectual rupture between Rus and the Praxis group. Here, Rus explored the implications of recent sociological findings, suggesting that the goal of participation in self-management institutions had become less salient to Yugoslav workers after 1967. Quote, from 1962 to 1967, it was found that employees wanted the distribution of power, which is closer to normative than to actual structures of power. In the past 2 years, we have found that employees' aspirations approach closer and closer to actual structures and move further and further from normative ones. End quote. Veljko Rus, Self-Management and Egalitarianism and Social Differentiation. Looking at the footnote. Footnote. The studies cited by Rus are the status of stat and line management with respect to communications, power, and responsibility. Rus's study, comparative analysis of communications, power, and responsibility in two industrial enterprises. Stana Mozina and Yenish Yarovsek. Janusz Yarovsek's article, Determinants Influencing Effectiveness of Leadership in Industrial Organizations. Rus's conclusions are supported by Obradovich, who reports results of investigations between 1967 and 1971, showing that the degree of participation on the enterprise level does not have a significant effect on positive attitudes toward work, and varies directly only with such secondary factors as satisfaction with income and working conditions. These later variables, in turn, are apparently only reflections of the higher status of those who participated more often. According to Rus, the explanation of this de-radicalization of workers' norms was to be found in the distribution of power within the enterprises brought about by increased differentiation in the technical-functional division of labor. What should be sought under such circumstances is, he contended, a, quote, pluralist centralism, end quote, consisting of a distribution of, quote, active and, quote, passive power, corresponding to positions in the functional hierarchy, and a mode of conflict resolution characterized by both bargaining and participation. This argument seemed to presuppose a Saint-Simonian vision of a natural hierarchy of social functions which, although distinctly anti-egalitarian in its thrust, and perhaps because of this very factor, enjoyed increasing support in Yugoslavia in the wake of the liberal economic reforms of the mid-1960s. Footnote: the most prominent spokesman against the egalitarian consciousness is inconsistent with industrialization has been Zagreb sociologist Josip Zupanov. End footnote. It was precisely, however, this anti-egalitarian impulse, at least in terms of the distribution of power, that was most sharply at variance with the social vision held by the, quote, mainstream Praxis theorists. Indeed, Roos concluded his 1970 essay by remarking that the chief failing of Praxis criticism lay in its romantic fixation on democratic norms whose time was long past. Quote, this radical criticism of everything that exists was dogmatic in the sense that it had never attempted a, quote, revision of fundamental values in the name of practice, but rather merely emphasized the fact that social practice is far removed from proclaimed ideals, ... It was not creative to the extent that it did not point out the necessity of certain reinterpretations or redefinitions of the fundamental values which were the starting point of this criticism. End quote. Roos. Self-management egalitarianism. Roos's disenchantment with Praxis then derived intellectually from an observed shift in workers' attitudes and the broader implications for the political structure of self-management which they seem to suggest. For Roos, Praxis's commitment to participatory democracy through workers' management, indeed the entire traditional Yugoslav theory of self-management, which has served for nearly 2 decades as the cornerstone of the official ideology, had been outmoded by industrial progress and technical specialization. Self-management in its classic participatory form, Roos suggests, is basically a pre-industrial utopia whose feasibility treats with the advance of modern industrial society. It should be noted that Roos's skepticism, at least in a methodological sense, is valid only to the extent that the articulated political norms of industrial workers, or for that matter of any members of any political unit, expressed in response to inquiries of a sociological investigator, can be universally accepted as, quote, realistic in a given historical context. In fact, this is a dangerous assumption to make, for it at least potentially neglects the ideologically stultifying effects that existing structures can have on political attitudes. Even as early as 1965, Supek had maintained that attitudes expressed at the level of immediate production are not necessarily accurate measures of, quote, public opinion, since for Supek, the very concept of public opinion is one which has programmatic as well as descriptive aspects. Quote, opinions on the role of workers' self-management have even been advanced recently that are more Fourierist than Marxist. For example, when it is maintained that in our country, quote, public opinion is formed at the level of the structure of society and workers' self-management, end quote. Concluding that we have no need of institutes for the sounding of public opinion. This would mean that society is transformed into a system of atoms or molecules in which each thinks and decides according to his own criteria. But we know that Marx was a fierce adversary of localism and of enclosing man within socially determined limits. For him, development necessarily proceeds in the sense of universal consciousness of man, the identification of the individual with all of humanity. End quote. Supek. While for Roos, then, the accommodation of participatory norms for structures in economic enterprises represented an important step on the road to democracy without illusions, most Praxis Marxists would have argued that this accommodation was a sign of something much more serious, the illusion of democracy, whose roots lay deep in the still incomplete nature of the self-management system. Supek's comments on, quote, localism bring to light another dimension of the Praxis critique of Yugoslav self-management. For the Praxis critique of bureaucratism does not preclude an aversion to the opposite extreme of undiscriminating decentralization. Mere decentralization from below may represent, as Markovitch warns, a type of, quote, polycentrism without decrease in the total amount of the alienated political power, end quote. While Zagorka Pesic reminds us in this connection that, quote, bureaucracy as a constituent element of political power can be transcended only through the transcendence of politics as a distinct and professionalized sphere of social decision-making, that is, through the, quote, socialization of politics, end quote, end quote. Footnote, on the distinction between democracy and decentralization and its relation to the polemic between Marx and the proponents of Bakunin and Proudhon, see Lyubomir Tadic. Some article that in some language. And footnote. With respect to self-management, the decentralization of economic decision-making power to the enterprise level may not, as we have seen, necessarily imply any greater access to these decisions for those affected by them. Numerous studies of Yugoslav self-management have shown that workers are often presented with decisions by the technocratic infrastructure of the enterprise as virtual fait accompli, ready for ratification, and that workers are generally very poorly informed about the issues in each case, having no independent basis to evaluate alternative courses of action. A potentially more serious consequence of this type of decentralization, however, is the potential gap between the interests of the enterprise and those of the community at large. This disparity has been reflected in the increasingly exclusive nature of the interest of each enterprise vis-a-vis other enterprises, as well as its renewed interest in the territorial political commune as an alternative instrument for the political integration of conflicting interests. To be sure, the, quote, localism of the self-managing enterprise is not necessarily inconsistent with bureaucratic statism. So long as, quote, social interests are authoritatively dictated by the state, it may be expected that individual social components will naturally tend to pursue selfish interests so long as it is in their power to do so. Quote, the liberty of a subject lieth therefore only in those things. Quote, the liberty of a subject, Jesus Christ, quote, the liberty of a subject lieth therefore only in those things which in regulating their actions the sovereign hath pretermitted. End quote. Hobbes, Leviathan, chapter 21. And as Stoyanovich suggested, the reverse relationship holds as well. Quote, self-government based exclusively on groups will reinforce the power of the state rather than negating it. So long as integration, coordination, regulation, and planning are not inherent in self-government, these functions will have to be performed by an alienated part of society, the state. When there is no real community, a surrogate for it becomes indispensable. The Yugoslav experience shows that the state can easily manipulate atomized self-government. End quote. Stoyanovich. The behavior of individual enterprises does in fact seem to be guided by selfish motives of a purely economic nature, with feverish competition rather than cooperation and coordination characterizing inter-enterprise relations. The attitude of the enterprise toward the productive resources within its own domain is, as Stoyanovich points out, more aptly described by the term, quote, group ownership than anything approaching, quote, social ownership, end quote. While an entire ideology, which Stoyanovich has called, quote, socialist anarcho-liberalism, end quote, has grown up around this subsystem of relations. This ideology, as Stoyanovich explicates it, is one which has several features in common with the ideology of liberal capitalism. a belief in the spontaneous integration of private interest through the independent economic mechanisms of the market, fear of all coordination, regulation, and planning, a bourgeois doctrine of freedom which defines freedom as, quote, the right to do everything which does not harm others, end quote, and finally a commutative concept of justice in which, quote, each person ought to receive as much in social distribution as he has earned on the market, end quote, to the exclusion of more egalitarian notions of distributive justice. The resemblance of these assumptions to the doctrines of Proudhon has been pointed out by more than one Praxis Marxist. Yet the experience of Yugoslav self-management would seem to demonstrate the ultimate futility of Proudhon's stateless system of associations bound together only by contracts and a spirit of, quote, mutuality. Quote, especially in our, quote, Balkan conditions, end quote, unquote, writes Supek, economic development left solely to the market, quote, will need continual compromises and a single arbiter in the resolution of continual disputes, end quote. In Yugoslavia, this function of integration is performed by that institution which still maintains hegemony over the, quote, vertical organization of social power, end quote, the Communist Party. As Supek's vision of a system of self-management based on collectives whose social functions extend beyond the purely economic sphere reminds us, confinement of the enterprise's interest to economic interest alone may play a large role in the inability of self-managing collectives to establish an adequate framework for integration on a cooperative basis. Be that as it may, the existing system is torn between statism from above and the market from below, these two elements being present in proportions which have varied over time but which have characteristically shifted in favor of the former in periods of acute national crisis. It is in this connection that Stoyanovich speaks of a, quote, vivid dualism in practice, end quote, between, quote, self-managing groups in the base and a rather strong statist structure above them, end quote. Stoyanovich, neither of which seems to hold much hope for the future of a democratic socialism. New section, Economic Reforms and the Emergence of a Market Society. The economic reforms of 1965 played an important role in the decentralization of functions discussed above. The reforms were primarily aimed at reducing the power of the state and its central bureaucratic apparatus in the coordination of economic affairs. Advocates of the reforms claimed that they would stimulate a general shift in the balance of power from the state to the individual enterprise, thereby bringing social power closer to the immediate producers, and indeed, as a result of the reforms, individual enterprises obtain a broad, if still limited, control over profits and investment. They are even allowed, under certain conditions, to sell bonds to the public and plan their own growth and future needs, as well as to sign contracts directly with foreign corporations for joint economic ventures. Thus, while the doctrine of the, quote, withering away of the state, end quote, certainly has yet to be accomplished in Yugoslavia, the withering away of the state's functions in the field of direct economic planning and control seem to have been brought significantly closer to realization by the reforms. Nevertheless, the overall impact of the reforms has been mixed at best. The luster of increased consumer production and the new attraction that Yugoslavia holds for foreign investors have been dulled by strong inflationary tendencies, an unusually high rate of chronic unemployment, and a large foreign labor force, together with new patterns of social stratification and regional rivalries which have fed the flames of nationalist sentiment. Indeed, one is tempted to turn back the clock to the reaction of former Polish party chief Władysław Gomułka to demands by Polish and Hungarian workers for factory self-management in 1956, when Gomułka warned that, quote, if every factory became a kind of cooperative enterprise of the workers, all the laws governing capitalist enterprise would inevitably come into effect and produce all the usual results, end quote. Gomułka, as quoted in Karl Reimann and Hermann Singer's article, The Origins and Significance of East European Revisionism, in the volume Revisionism. Perhaps more to the point, Marx once remarked that the, quote, competition among workers is only another form of the competition among capitals, end quote. End footnote. And for Yugoslavia's leaders, the problem of how to reap the fruits of liberal economics while avoiding its pitfalls has represented a major concern over the past decade. The foregoing is not to suggest, of course, that the position of the Praxis Marxists on self-management should in any way be compared to that of Gomulka. Although their detractors often tried to blur the popular mind by identifying the Praxis thinkers with, quote, bureaucratic centralist forces, end quote, on the basis of the openly expressed Praxis opposition to, quote, market socialism. Footnote, and alternatively with the forces of, quote, anarcho-liberalism. See Deborah Milinkovic's book, Plan and Market in Yugoslav Economic Thought. The extent of the Praxis Marxist opposition to the market system is in fact matched only by their mistrust of the state-controlled economy on the Soviet model, insofar as both in their view tend to deprive the producers of control over the products of their labor and especially over surplus value. What the Praxis Marxists would seem to advocate instead is a mixed system of market and plan on the basis of workers' self-management, a system, however, in which neither plan nor market would have the alienating consequences that they have in existing societies. This view of socialist economics, they are convinced, is the most thoroughly Marxian approach inasmuch as it fetishizes no specific set of economic relations and is most consonant with Marx's own critique of alienated labor. Very little has been written by the Praxis Marxists concerning the problem of planning from a strictly economic standpoint. To be sure, their critique of the political and human aspects of Stalinism has strong implications which carry over into the economic area as well. In general, however, quote, planning, in the sense of coordination or redistribution of investment resources, Praxis Marxists from Zagreb are perhaps less enthusiastic with respect to the latter. Has been supported by several Praxis Marxists as a mechanism that would help to counteract the centrifugal forces of regional economic differentiation. Markovich, however, has stressed that in whatever measure planning is present in the economy, it must be a type of planning that is democratic in nature. Thus, he has proposed a system of central planning organs constituted through local, territorial, and regional self-managing councils, which would exist independently of the state apparatus. Through this mechanism, he contends, it would be possible to determine democratically the general economic and social goals that would be pursued by enterprise and the economy as a whole. Quote, analytical groups and centers, and quote, responsible only to these planning organs would be responsible for offering alternative methods of achieving these goals. In this way, the monopoly of the technocratic infrastructure, which tends to define both goals and methods, presenting society with a single plan, to which there can be no alternative at all, would be decisively broken, and control of the economy would be returned to the producers and their organs of self-management. Footnote. Markovich also set forth his views on this question in a discussion organized by the editorial board of the Belgrade journal Gledista. End footnote. Indeed, even in a society without formal planning, it is Markovich's fear that the alienation of the producers may be just as great as in a totally planned economy as a consequence of the monopoly over economic decision-making exercised by technocratic forces, which act according to their own very restricted notions of rationality and efficiency. Neither in the planned economy or in the market economy, therefore, do the producers have a real opportunity to evaluate alternative courses of action in accordance with their human needs. Thus, when Markovitch, along with other Praxis Marxists, speaks of the need for rational direction and coordination in the economy, it suffices to say that he has in mind a humanistic notion of rationality, which may differ substantially from what a federal planning official or a local managerial specialist may see as being, quote, rational from a purely economic standpoint. Beautiful day. All right, Mom.
You don't even have to rake them.
Mom, say hello to the internet. I'm recording now.
Hi, internet.
All right. I'll catch up with you, Mom. I promise. The Praxis Marxists are more commonly associated in Yugoslavia, however, with their critique of the market economy and the consequences of the economic reforms of the mid-1960s. Yet in spite of their theoretical predispositions, they are not totally intransigent toward the market as an economic mechanism, nor toward commodity production as a temporary, if distasteful, necessity. Stoyanovich, for instance, has conceded that insofar as the market tends to reveal imbalances and concealed inertia in the statist economic system and stimulates a healthy competition, it performs a vital social function. Furthermore, Stoyanovich maintains that for the foreseeable future, the production of, quote, use values mediated through, quote, exchange values is the sole hope of progress towards material abundance. At the same time, however, he warns, quote, so long as it exists, the market will try to impose itself over society as the supreme regulator and criterion of human relations, ... The market reacts mainly to the existing level of demand and ... creates artificial and even harmful demands. It thus comes into conflict with the mission of socialist community, which seeks to humanize existing need and develop new human needs. Without rational control of economic tendencies by the associated producers, socialism in Marxist sense is out of the question, quote, Stoyanovich. Elsewhere, Stoyanovich observes that the, quote, market can lead to the discovery and rejection of statist and other kinds of privilege. Quote, market can lead to the discovery and rejection of statist and other kinds of privilege. However, the market also facilitates the development of another kind of privilege based upon monopolistic position, speculation, the accidental influence of circumstances, and so on. The anarcho-liberals oppose all corrective measures and plead for the totally free operation of the market, ... Even capitalism began attempting long ago to prevent the accumulation of super profits based on monopoly. End quote. Stoyanovich, Between Ideals and Reality. Thus, it is not the market itself, properly kept within bounds, that the Praxis Marxists fear so much as the unrestricted action of the market and the hegemony of the market principle when extended indiscriminately to all areas of social life. It is in this connection that Markovitch warns against the ideological system of, quote, economism, which he contends was given new vigor by the economic reforms. He describes, quote, economism, a close relation to Stoyanovich's, quote, socialist anarcho-liberalism, end quote, as a set of assumptions about social life which depict man as an economic being motivated entirely by selfish and consumption-oriented interests. This economism, Markovitch contends, visualizes the maximization of income as the highest goal of socialist society and asserts, in Markovitch's words, that, quote, the most important thing for socialism at this moment is complete liberation of economic laws and the undisturbed development of commodity-money relations, end quote. The fetishization, that's the quotes from Markovitch in an article titled Economism, or The Humanization of Economics, published in Praxis 1969. Footnote. In this passage, Markovitch is not conjuring up merely a fictional straw man. In fact, he reasonably accurately summarizes the argument of an influential article in a 1965 issue of Nosa Tema that sparked a long debate on the question of the market simultaneously with the promulgation of the economic reforms. End footnote. The fetishization of the market principle is also evident in the officially accepted notion of, quote, socialist commodity production, end quote, which is rejected by the Praxis Marxists as a contradiction in terms that cannot provide a suitable basis for a socialist economy. However unavoidable commodity production may appear in the short run, nor are they persuaded by those who provoke the necessity of developing a strong material base as the absolute precondition of socialism, thereby justifying the free action of economic laws and even development of social inequalities. Such arguments, in their view, differ little in substance from the demagogic appeals of Stalinism to the citizenry to forego the immediate material satisfaction in the interest of the future communist society. Both ideologically justify alienation in this world with the promise of salvation in the next. Similarly, the much vaunted, quote, socialist principle of, quote, distribution according to work, end quote, has come under Praxis criticism for its insensitivity to the human values of solidarity, equality, and justice. Stoyanovich and, there's a typo here, how do you say this person's name? Miladin Životić, for instance, have devoted much effort and passion to arguing for a moral principle of equality which would counteract the inherent inequalities built into the principle that a producer should be paid fairly for commodities produced, i.e., without the extraction of surplus value by others who convert this material surplus into social privilege. Footnote. See Stoyanovich, Between Ideals and Reality, and Miladin Životić's article, Is Equality a Moral Value of Our Society? And footnote. Apart from the purely moral dimension, the principle of equal pay for equal work is, as Životić notes, at best a bourgeois principle of equity which Marx wrote, quote, This equal right is an unequal right for unequal labor, ... It is therefore a right of inequality in its content like every right. It is therefore a right of inequality in its content like every right, end quote. Marx. Critique of the Gotha Program. Footnote, and this is a Marx quote, quite apart from the analysis so far given, quote, end quote, quote, it was in general incorrect to make a fuss about so-called, quote, distribution and the principal stress on it. End quote. Marx. End footnote. The equality inhering in this principle is one determined by the impersonal laws of the market and presumes by its very nature the alienation of labor that Marx so roundly condemned. In this connection, Deborah Milenkovic observes, quote, the traditional socialist principle of distribution, quote, the traditional socialist principle of distribution, quote, to each according to his work, end quote, has been revised by the Yugoslavs, becoming, quote, to each according to the factors of production supplied by the human agent or to which the human agent has access, as valued on the imperfect market, end quote. This principle is scarcely distinguishable from that of private enterprise, end quote. Životić. Milenkovic, excuse me. Deborah Milenkovic. In an article titled, Which Direction for Yugoslavia's Economy? When the Praxis Marxists find particular what the Praxis Marxists find particularly objectionable in this respect is the reification of the market principle and its enshrinement at the level of permanent moral truth. For the eminent Belgrade sociologist Radomir Lukic, for instance, the principle of distribution according to work is, quote, intimately linked to the very principle of socialism, end quote, and to violate it out of egalitarian motives, quote, would signify no less than a desire for exploitation, for the appropriation of the surplus of the better producers, end quote. It is this confusion between socialist ends and essentially bourgeois means that Stoyanovich rejects when Stoyanovich refers to, quote, people who, in the guise of reform, are intensifying their efforts to liquidate communism in general, along with its more immature manifestations. Reform and modernization are the slogans not only of those people who are oriented towards socialism, they are employed by, quote, socialist, anarcho-liberalism, and technocratism as well, end quote. Stoyanovich. The question of the market principle in the sphere of culture as an area of activity which is naturally of great concern to the Praxis Marxists is a case in point. One of the consequences of the broad sweep of the economic reform was to put all cultural enterprises, as well as industrial enterprises, at the mercy of the market, evidently with the intention of eliminating statist domination in this area. The eminent Zagreb sociologist Josip Zupanov replied in 1968 to the critics of commercialism in culture, supplied part of the rationale behind these measures, albeit with an important caveat. Quote, when commercialism is frontally attacked, the only thing that is demonstrated is a misunderstanding of the market mechanism. The market is precisely a daily plebiscite of a great number of people about the values and uses of various products and services. If, as a result of such a plebiscite, intellectual products come out badly, then the evil lies not in the fact of the plebiscite, but in the inadequate position of those who make the products, end quote. Josip Zupanov. The exponential growth of the dime novel and pornographic market since the mid-1960s in comparison with other areas of Yugoslav publishing activity bears adequate testament to the fact that, quote, intellectual products have indeed, quote, come out badly, end quote, in recent years. Stoyanovich complains that, quote, individual groups, self-governing now, can use the market to encourage the most uncultured of needs and make quite a bit of money in the process, end quote. Stoyanovich. And while recognizing the undesirability of eliminating all market elements from the spheres of cultural production and distribution, Markovich at the same time observes that, quote, it would be wrong to think that the market in socialism ought to be the sole and exclusive regulator of conditions in the area of culture. For after all, such is not the case even in capitalism. Benefactors, powerful private foundations, churches, and the state have never ceased to intervene energetically in the area of science, art, and cultural creativity in general. Without such important correctives of commodity-money relations, it is problematic whether bourgeois society would have created even a small part of what it was able to create. End quote. Markovich. Rudy Supek, who of all the Praxis Marxists has generally displayed the greatest concern in questions of cultural creativity and awareness, takes the argument one step further by contending that there is a basic inconsistency between culture and the market principle, the former stressing universal human values and the latter involving what are essentially private and selfish interests. The problem is not only, writes Supek, that the ideas of particular groups or persons tend to be presented in the world of commercialized culture as the only, quote, true ideas, but also that, quote, every general idea evokes suspicion, mistrust, and questions as to whether all that is at issue is some sort of mystification or dissemblance. Thus people are ashamed of such ideas, and the universal and the international increasingly retreat before the particular, the ethnocentric, the nationalistic, and localistic. Clannish thinking takes the place of class thinking, and the quote end of ideology in this case represents no more than the end of common ideals and the need to sacrifice something for them, end quote. Rudy Supek. In contrast to Zupanov, when Supek suggests that the market principle is itself profoundly at variance with the ends of cultural activity. In contrast to Zupanov, then, Supek suggests that the market principle is itself profoundly at variance with the ends of cultural activity. To be sure, Supek would not find it difficult to agree with Zupanov's proposition that the real problem may lie in the, quote, inadequate position of those who make the bracket cultural and bracket products, end quote. Zupanov. Footnote, see Supek something, I think it translates to Socialism and Sociology, where Supek pleads for the thorough application of the principle of self-management to the sphere of culture, and especially to that of the distribution of cultural products. End footnote. But what Supek wishes to warn against here is principally the fetishization of the market principle of socialism. The, quote, humanist critique of the economic reform, he asserts, is directed mainly toward the, quote, transformation of certain economic measures into a social ideology, end quote. Insofar as the reform's measures were designed to achieve greater economic efficiency and to crush, quote, centralistic parasitism, end quote, they were laudable, but once they became cast as ends in themselves, the results obtained were counterproductive and harmful for the prospects for socialism, to wit, quote, profit proceeds not from greater devotion to one's work and better organization, but rather from a greater ability to manipulate the market, speculation, pseudo-competition, which in Yugoslavia customarily reduces itself to the rule, quote, fleece the consumer, end quote, end quote. Supek. Just such negative consequences of the economic reform became evident shortly after its introduction in 1965. The social basis of the new mentality, according to some Praxis Marxists, was to be found in a new and burgeoning economic class with all the markings of, quote, petty bourgeois capitalism, end quote, without, however, the aspirations towards universal cultural values which ordinarily endow bourgeois ideology with much of its persuasive force. In a controversial 1971 article, Milan Kundera presented this new, quote, middle class as having its historical roots not in the relatively weak interwar Yugoslav bourgeoisie, but in the development of Yugoslav society after 1945, in a class hostile to Marxian and all leftist thought and to the aspirations of the working class, a class which in fact viewed true Marxists as, quote, class enemies, end quote. This new class, wrote Kundera, aspired to, quote, constitute itself economically, to become socially established, politically situated and ideologically and intellectually shaped and reinforced on the level of the liberal bourgeoisie, end quote. Kundera described this class's rise to power in the following terms, quote, for a good many years we can follow this quickened process from day to day of the birth, growth, entrenchment, stabilization, penetration, and consolidation of the middle class, which dizzyingly, in the course of our specific and prolonged, quote, primary accumulation of capital, end quote, strengthens itself economically, augments its wealth, takes the conduct of the affairs of the entire society into its own hands, attracting in its wake other social elements and strata, corrupting them, spreading the ideological influence, and drawing itself into all the pores of society, political, economic, social, cultural, theoretical, and philosophical, and even further becoming an ever more dominant intellectual and ideological force in our society, ... It is even attempting to transform the League of Communists into its own mass party, which from year to year is statistically in terms of numerical composition and social character of its membership, ... becoming ever easier to demonstrate, end quote. Milan Kundera. Underlying the growth of this new, quote, middle class, unquote, was the growth of new institutional centers of economic power, independent of both the state and the workers engaged in production. The dramatic increase in the power of large commercial firms and banks, the latter coming to play a major role in investment allocations, concurrently with the atrophy of certain of central and local planning mechanisms, was indeed perhaps the most important large-scale structural legacy of the economic reforms. The much-debated constitutional amendments of 1971 represented a consolidation of the position of those enterprises, granting them the status of, quote, self-managing organizations, unquote, with the right to increase their income and to dispose of, quote, profits in accordance with their own wishes. Supek noted in this connection that the, quote, economic reform has led many production organizations into a difficult situation and has facilitated the rapid rise of the financial organizations to their monopolistic position. While the banks, says Hanks here, the banks and commerce previously served the development of industrial production. Now industrial production serves the strengthening of the economic power of the financial centers, which is, of course, is contrary to the interests of the working class as it is harmful to the policy of economic development, end quote. Supek. This juridical identification of productive and intermediary associations was also decried by Vranitzky on the grounds that the latter do not produce surplus value and hence merely dispose of the capital produced by others. This confusion, Vranitzky added, did, quote, serious harm to several essential principles of socialist relations and solidarity, end quote. Vranitzky. Nowhere was the harmful impact of the reforms of the mid-1960s on, quote, socialist relations and solidarity, end quote, more evident than in the reappearance of severe national conflict within the Yugoslav Federation. For after nearly 2 decades of relative tranquility and national amity, so uncharacteristic of the troubled Balkans, the late 1960s and early 1970s saw a rekindling of national animosities of sufficient intensity to put into question the viability of the Yugoslav multinational idea. For the Praxis Marxists, the resurgence of the explosive, quote, nationalities question, end quote, represented the culmination and crisis of the economic political reforms. This is not to say, however, that the Praxis Marxists saw the solution of this issue in a new set of economic or political measures, since they recognized that the problem of nationalities conflict had become so entangled with moral and ideological overtones that a purely economic or political approach, such as introduction of a greater degree of central planning and resource allocation, coupled with political re-centralization, would serve only further to confound the issue. Indeed, with their uncompromising critique of political and economic alienation in mind, it would seem clear that in the Praxis view, any solution that relies principally on, quote, merely political or economic measures would serve in the end only to perpetuate and compound an alienated condition that is sharply at odds with the fundamental goals of socialism. New section. Nationalism and the nationalist mystification. Quote, La patrie des philosophes, it's me, I don't know how to pronounce French. Quote, La patrie des philosophes, c'est la patrie de la liberté, or liberté, which I'm assuming it means is like the party of philosophy is the party of liberty. I'm not sure if that's the actual what it translates, but that's my guess. That's a title of Danko Grilich's contribution to Praxis International edition, numbers 3 to 4, 1968. The concept of nationalism as the ideology of an ascendant middle class has always been an integral part of Marxian theory. It was in the German ideology that Marx observed in connection with his discussion of the modern nation state that, quote, the bourgeoisie is forced to organize itself no longer locally but nationally and to give a general form to its mean average interest, end quote. Marx. German ideology. The Praxis Marxists have maintained that this concept of Marxian social analysis remains every bit as powerful for the analysis of socialist as of capitalist societies, and they have not hesitated, regardless of the serious risk to which it has exposed them, to bring such analysis to bear upon Yugoslavia's present difficulties. For it has been their contention that the new Yugoslav middle class, the beneficiary of post-war Yugoslavia's economic progress, consisting, according to Ivan Kovacic, of, quote, employees of enterprises, offices, commercial, and several other social service organizations, end quote, a class in search of an ideology, has found its ideology in nationalism. This nationalism, like its classic predecessors of the 19th century, links the interests of the class with those of the state, which in turn is presented as embracing the interests of society at large. It is this deliberate ideological misrepresentation of narrow economic interest as general social interest which is the key for the Praxis Marxists, as for Marx himself, to understanding and exposing nationalism for the collective fiction, the modern, quote, opiate of the masses, end quote, for which it is. To be sure, modern Yugoslav nationalism thrives on other elements than economic conflict alone. What we today call Yugoslavia is the result of decades of dedicated effort, struggle, and bloodshed toward the goal of transforming age-old rivalries and hatreds into the basis of a peaceful and prosperous multinational community. An invisible line crudely dividing the country between North and South testifies to deep historical conflicts that are reckoned by the centuries between Catholics and Orthodox, Christian and Turk, European and Slav, quote, West and, quote, East. For a while after the end of the Second World War, it had seemed as if these tensions had been all but submerged by the urgent need for national unity in the face of economic isolation and military threats from abroad. But with the gradual abatement of these dangers, the idea of a, quote, Yugoslav nation, end quote, as the ideological cornerstone of national harmony began to decline in popular acceptance. To this cultural vacuum, there were eventually added sources of economic conflict which reinforced and aggravated traditional cultural animosities, yielding a sure formula for renewed political tension which, if unattended, would have inevitably break out into the open. Interregional economic rivalry, it is true, is nothing new to Yugoslavia. Her northern regions, once provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, historically enjoyed a higher level of economic development and prosperity than her southern territories, which had been among the most backward dependencies of the Ottoman Empire. The pattern of Yugoslav economic development after 1919 and into the post-World War II era only developed after into the post-World War II era only tended to aggravate these disparities, although especially in the latter period efforts were made to reinvest excess, quote, northern returns to the southern regions. But the decentralizing reforms of the mid-1960s, while perhaps a step forward from the standpoint of economic efficiency at the local level, sowed the seeds of serious inter-republican conflict. One of their effects was to encourage the growth of antagonistic national centers of economic power by transferring the responsibility for much hitherto federally controlled capital to the republican level. Control over much of the country's productive industrial resources reverted to Croatian and Slovenian interest, while the traditional center of commerce and banking, Belgrade, firmed its grasp on these valuable resources, but now at the level of the Republic. Economic decentralization was simultaneously reinforced by a decentralization of political decision-making power, with the growth of substantial Republican bureaucracies to cope with the new responsibilities bestowed on them. Finally, in order to articulate the competing interests bred by this new state of affairs, there emerged reinvigorated nationalist ideologies and their spokesmen in Republican political structures. Thus, modern Yugoslav nationalism may be understood as the result of a peculiar conjunction of two important factors, to a critique of which the Praxis Marxists have devoted much of their writing on political and social issues, the negative side effects of the growth of a market economy, along with the still incomplete debureaucratization of Yugoslav political life, and it should not be surprising, then, to find that the Praxis Marxists have reserved some of their most passionate rhetoric for discussions of the controversial, quote, nationalities question, end quote, and for acerbic and provocative critiques of the obfuscations of nationalist ideology. The nationalist spirit has found expression in the economic sphere in the militancy with which spokesmen from the economically more developed republics, principally Croatia and Slovenia, have decried the funneling of excess profits from their economies to the underdeveloped republics where investment resources are desperately needed. Such profits would be better and more efficiently utilized, they maintain, in reinvestment in their own republics, while they portray the less economically developed republics as a burden on the development of the national economy as a whole. Footnote. Never mind, no footnote. The Praxis Marxist Milodan Životić alludes to this attitude when he deplores, quote, various particularisms, localisms, duplication of economic facilities, and other forms of anarchy, profiteering appetites, investment in economically unjustified projects, and the tendency to forget the Yugoslav community as a whole, ... end quote. Životić. Although it is not so clear whether the, quote, moral principle, end quote, of equality which he advocates would do much to alleviate the situation, and Rudy Sipik more directly addressing the dangers of the kind of regional autarky advocated by the most extreme nationalist spokesman, warns that attempts to establish economic independence from forces within the community on a weak economic basis openly invites a state of semi-dependence on foreign capital similar to the situation which prevailed in Yugoslavia prior to the Second World War. This is not to say, however, that the Praxis Marxists have adhered to an absolutely unified position with respect to intra-Yugoslav regional economic rivalries. Indeed, a close reading between the lines might reveal that some Zagreb Praxis theorists, Supek for instance, have occasionally made certain concessions to the claims of their regional compatriots by deploring the growth and power of the Belgrade banks, whereas their Serbian colleagues, e.g. Markovic, Stojanovic, and Životić, may often have tended to give greater emphasis to the egoistic behavior of wealthy industrial enterprises and to the need for greater regional equality and economic development, perhaps even at the cost of falling short of optimum efficiency. Despite these minor differences in emphasis, however, the most important contribution of the Praxis Marxists to this picture has been their common insistence that what is at issue in regional economic clashes is not the allocation of resources to entire national communities, which are internally homogeneous, but rather the competition for these resources among different segments of essentially the same economic class, a class which cross-cuts Republican boundaries, at the expense of other segments of the same class and of the working class as a whole. The statist element in Yugoslav inter-Republican nationalism has been closely tied to the autarkic tendencies noted above. The incomplete decentralization of real political power, stopping at the level of the Republican bureaucracies, paralleled and reinforced the regionalization of economic interest to the extent that the Croatian League of Communists itself was an important locus of nationalist sentiments, especially from 1969 to 1971. Footnote. What is said here with respect to Croatia only represents the most extreme instance of a general malaise throughout Yugoslavia, one which seems to have been alleviated through the party upheaval since 1972. Indeed, the Sisak District Court, in its 1971 decision to ban the 3-4 1971 issue of Praxis, found most offensive about Congrega's article about the, quote, ideological political advance of the Yugoslav middle class, end quote, was the latter's contention that the factual existence of at least 6 leagues of communists in the country corresponding to the six republics, demonstrated that Yugoslav advocates of multi-partyism need look no further than present political reality. End footnote. The Croatian party leader Mika Tripalo, deposed in 1972, formulated Croatian political aspirations under the slogan of, quote, Republican statehood, end quote, which involved, in George Schopflin's words, quote, very far-reaching powers over political and economic matters, ... The proclamation of a barely veiled nationalist ideology that in practice regarded the national interest as higher than that of class, end quote. Parenthesis, indeed, at the height of nationalist sentiment in Croatia in 1971, the increasingly influential group around the journal Hrvatski Tjednik and the Matica Hrvatska publishing house began to agitate for Croatian independence even in the areas of foreign affairs and defense. Fuck, I lost my spot. Hold on. Tripalo's ideal of national, quote, statehood gained a great deal of popularity because of the common heritage it claimed with both the Croatian national struggle of the 19th century and the Yugoslav anti-Stalinist struggle of the 20th. In his effort to strengthen the power of the Croatian Republican bureaucracy, Tripalo even drew at times on the rhetoric of self-management by expanding it to embrace the nation as a whole, irrespective of class divisions within particular national communities. The Praxis Marxists reacted vigorously against such transparent attempts to depart from Marxist teachings about nationalism in the cloak of Marxist phraseology. Jan Kongraga's comments about nationalism in contemporary Yugoslavia could easily have been written by Marx himself a century before. Quote, the nation is precisely par excellence the political creation of the bourgeois class. ... is nothing other than the politically constituted people in the state. It is thus at the same time necessarily a class creation, which assumes and implies the power of the bourgeoisie over the working class and all other classes, ... and strata of society. There is no nation without its own state, ... That is abundantly clear. But it is just as clear that the modern state, ... is only the state as the political instrument for safeguarding the ruling interest, ... of the bourgeois class and the bureaucracy, and simultaneously for the oppression and exploitation of the working class of the very same nation. End quote. Kongraga. It has been precisely this effort to conceal class division by appealing to the concept of the nation in which the Praxis Marxists have seen the most unmistakable sign of the ideological nature of the new nationalism. Footnote, see for instance Kongraga's, I don't know, some article. It looks like it might be translated as phenomenology. I don't know. This argument is very widespread in Praxis writings. Kovacic, in fact, refers it to at least one study which suggests that Yugoslav workers, especially the more militant ones, are little concerned with nationalism as a major economic or political issue. Footnote, see an article by Danko Grilic for a characteristically strong stream of abuse directed against the attempt to transcend class differences by invoking the concept of the nation. End footnote. Quote, the nation state, end quote, writes Ljubomir Tadic, quote, may be a free state while man may not be a free man, end quote. A younger Praxis Marxist from Zagreb, Zarko Puhovsky, recalls the past extremes to which the fetishization of the nation has been taken in the statement made by the fascist leader of the puppet, quote, independent Croatian state during the Second World War, Ante Pavelic, quote, our internal political structure will be such that the nation, without so-called democracy, without the speculation of politicians, will itself make sovereign decisions in its own essential and vital interests, end quote. Ante Pavelic. All this is to say that the new Yugoslav nationalism embodies the same ideological friction as its classic predecessors in representing the territorial consolidation of state power as the liberation of the nation. Tripala's concession that the concept of republican statehood does contain elements of, quote, republican atatism, end quote, although to be sure an essentially progressive form of statism, in parentheses, only serves to lay bare the, quote, concealed statism, end quote, which Mihailo Markovic believes is, quote, much more resistant and dangerous, end quote, than statism in its classical centralist Stalinist form. The former he holds is a, quote, invisible and uncontrolled statism, which often conceals itself behind the slogan of decentralization and the struggle against statism, end quote. That quote is from Markovic. For the Praxis Marxists, this nationalist ideology also has important philosophical implications which are evident in the way the nationalist consciousness approaches the human individual. Supek distinguishes between progressive and reactionary nationalism on the basis of two criteria: the relationship which each posits between man and time, history, and between individual and the larger community, politics. Any progressive nationalism, such as the rationalist ideology of the ascendant bourgeoisie at the time of the French Revolution, or the ideology of a national liberation struggle, must view man as primarily future-oriented and creative, rather than bound by past loyalties and identifications. With respect to its political worldview, Supek argues that conservative nationalism, he offers the examples of Demaist traditionalism, the, quote, school of historical law, end quote, as represented by Burke, von Savigny, and Stahl, in addition to Montesquieu's geographic determinism and social Darwinism, is basically irrationalist in outlook, postulating a total subordination of the individual to general metaphysical forces not subject to human control. That nationalism may at times play a progressive historical role, however, Supek does not rule out. Indeed, he observes that the, quote, national sentiment was born as an expression of the extension of the humanity of man, end quote. Rudy Supek. Supek's thoughts may be summarized in the following way: when nationalism broadens human perspectives and provides an increasing number of individuals with an awareness of their common social interests, it is, quote, progressive and to be valued. When, however, nationalism is restrictive and exclusive, artificially aggravating conflict in order to aggrandize the position of privileged social groups, it is reactionary and opposed to its very nature, by its very nature, to the development of a more humane society. Similarly, Supek's colleague Danko Grilic does not deny that in its struggle against reified, quote, supranational structures, end quote, nationalism has its positive aspects. Once this goal is achieved, however, nationalism loses its historical justification as a progressive ideology and serves only to blur the lines of class conflict and to submerge the individual personality in the national myth. Footnote: with respect to the loss of personality, Grilic cites Gramsci's dictum that, quote, it is useful to a person who has no personality to declare that he is essential to the national being, end quote. Turning to contemporary Yugoslavia, Grilic observes that even the political recruitment of leaders in the alienated nation-state becomes subject to nationalist mystification. The selection of cadres takes place less on the basis of universalistic criteria of merit than on the basis of purely ascriptive criteria, generating political leaders and functionaries, quote, who are no more than members of a nation, end quote. While Grilic condemns in no uncertain terms as the, quote, valorization of, quote, moral and intellectual zeros, end quote. It is, above all, the false and uncritical universalism of nationalism, the presentation of the, quote, national community, end quote, as the only basis for a true community, which the Praxis Marxists have found most deplorable in the nationalist phenomenon. And by the vehemence and consistency of their attacks on nationalism in general, they have left little doubt as to where they stand with respect to nationalism and its spokesman within the Yugoslav community of nations. Footnote, quote, it has been quickly forgotten that Serbian and Croatian nationalism have been and remain in both their Roman Catholic and Byzantine forms militant ideologies of a despotic type which have lacked political and cultural creativity, end quote. Ljubomir Tadic. It is a cosmopolitan vision summarized by Tadic when he writes that, quote, wait, was that started the plot right place? Oh, sorry. Wrong spot. End footnote. By the same token, certain pronouncements of the Praxis Marxists give one the impression that, in their view, the preeminently philosophical vocation somehow uniquely qualifies them to speak out critically on the problem of nationalism. Their vision of true philosophy as both rationalist and universalist distinguishes their position radically, they maintain, from the, quote, pure philosophy, end quote, propagated by various nationalist dandies, end quote, in Croatia, who call for the, quote, definitive liquidation of, quote, clearly analytical philosophy, end quote, end quote. It is a cosmopolitan vision summarized by Tadic when he writes that, quote, the nature of the thing is that philosophers speak the language of international entente, the language of universal human interest, and not of particular interest, end quote. Tadic. The radical critical posture of true philosophy is sharply contrasted by Grilic in his characteristically graphic style to the spirit of nationalist fetishism. Quote, you do not reason or theorize about the nation, for the nation you only struggle and die. You love the nation as the flesh of your flesh, as the essence of your being, drinking it with your mother's milk. It is body and blood, the heritage of our ancestors, the holy of holies, a call to militancy. It cannot be the subject of conceptual conclusions or of peaceful and dispassionate analysis, end quote. Grilic. With this in view, it is certainly no wonder that Supek, in the course of an analysis of the structural origins of nationalism, should have written in 1971 that, quote, historical experience shows that nationalists are incapable of solving the question of equal relations between nations, and now it is clear why they are not, end quote. Supek. It is not nearly so clear, however, that philosophy itself, even a truly critical philosophy, is capable of, quote, solving this important question either. Surely the issue of nationalism cannot be resolved entirely by, quote, peaceful and dispassionate analyses, end quote. Nor does the general Praxis position on philosophy discussed in Chapter 2 suggest that this is the case. There is no question among the Praxis Marxists that only practice can deal effectively with the national question. Specifically, revolutionary praxis informed by critical theory that would destroy entrenched centers of bureaucratic and economic power by realizing the principle of self-management in all areas and at all levels of social life. Perhaps it was the very far-sightedness of this vision, however, that was responsible for repeated accusations against the Praxis Marxists of, quote, centralism and, quote, unitarism, end quote, on the part of suspicious critics, especially in Croatia, whose number even included one of the former editors-in-chief of Praxis, whose commitment to various nationalist ideologies blinded them to the main thrust of Yugoslav Marxist humanism. To be sure, the Praxis Marxists gave their detractors ample ammunition in various editorial statements, and articles on the national question, to which one entire issue of Praxis in 1968 and large parts of other issues, especially numbers 3 to 4 of 1971, were devoted. Footnote. In its programmatic announcement on the possibility of a Yugoslav culture alongside the various national cultures, a rather unpopular position, particularly in Croatia, the editorship drew special attention to several of its other statements on the national question. On the other hand, Praxis' intensely anti-nationalist stance was one of its most well-known attributes within Yugoslavia, and perhaps its chief immediate asset in surviving as long as it did in the face of strong official antagonism. Indeed, it is one of the greatest paradoxes of Praxis' tragic history that it was the very success of the official campaign against nationalism which presaged the end of official tolerance for Praxis as well. For if it is true that the radical critique of nationalism was Praxis' saving grace for so many years in the eyes of the authorities, then the official victory over nationalism may well have divested the journal of its utility to the professional manipulators of power, leaving the journal to stand instead as nothing more than a source of constant discomfort to the regime. New section. Toward a closed society? ? Socialism is, quote, socialism is propagated, popularly explained, and its faithful gather in the newspaper columns, but no one thinks about it since it has long been proclaimed as being beyond doubt, end quote. Milan Miric. Quote, Falutin on the current, I don't know if I'm saying that right. How do you say it? Falutin? Feuilleton on the current moment of socialism, published in 1971. To follow the flow of articles in Praxis from its appearance in 1964 through the subsequent decade is to observe an unmistakable rising pessimism about the future of socialism in Yugoslavia among the Praxis contributors. The fate of the 1968 student uprisings, the appearance of a strong pseudo-liberal ideology in response to the economic reforms, the disappointing outcome of the debates on the constitutional amendments in 1970 to 71, the resurgence of a divisive nationalism, and the reassertion of a repressive apparatus in the cultural sphere. All these factors combined in the early 1970s to dampen the hopes of the Praxis Marxists for the future of the Yugoslav experiment in self-management, which in 1972 Stojanovic even went so far as to label in a Marcusian twist, quote, repressive self-management, end quote. Stojanovic. For Supek, the indomitable crusader for self-management, both at home and abroad, it must have been especially painful to write the following lines in the editorial introduction to the 1971 issue of Praxis dedicated to the, quote, the moment of Yugoslav socialism, quote. Quote, we should immediately add that the failures of Yugoslav economic policy and instances of the crisis of the working class movement, quote, we should immediately add that the failures of Yugoslav economic policy and instances of the crisis of the working class movement, bracket, in Yugoslavia, in bracket, have not been able to damage this evolution in creative Marxism and self-managing socialism, bracket, which as Supek presents it here originally grew from the Yugoslav experience and spread to the larger European community, end bracket. ... Although it is our sincere wish that our country will truly contribute to the growth of socialism as a system, it is just as encouraging for us to know that the victory of workers' self-management no longer depends upon our internal success or failure, regardless of the serious harm that this failure may do to the worldwide working class movement, especially after the shock it experienced in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Similar notes of discouragement were sounded by other Praxis Marxists. A year earlier, Markovic, whose reputation for political moderation among his Praxis colleagues was otherwise noteworthy, had publicly shifted his main hopes for revolutionary changes from the socialist East to the more developed West, asserting that, quote, Fundamental internal changes in the socialist countries cannot be expected in the foreseeable future. They will continue to industrialize, produce an ever greater abundance of commodities, services, and the most diverse kinds of institutions, but because of their bureaucratization, they have ceased to be a model for a more human and rational society, and can no longer exert a direct influence on world history merely by virtue of their very presence and competition with the opposing capitalist camp. They may liberalize themselves to a certain degree, but the real conditions for more decisive debureaucratization will be created only by means of possible revolutionary processes in the leading powers of the West. End quote. Markovich. Finally, Kovacic's lament should suffice to demonstrate the despair of the Praxis Marxists as a group about the, quote, Yugoslav path, end quote, to socialism. Quote, that our present social system does not represent a real basis for a qualitative change in the manner of life, and that one must not be given over to hoping that anything will issue from the present state of affairs is today more than obvious. End quote. What is presented in all these passages, that quote is from Markovich. What is presented in all these passages is a picture of an increasingly closed society, a society that is closed to prospects for further revolutionary praxis, whose institutions have entrenched themselves to such a degree that such transformation is, at least for the time being, out of the question. It is a, quote, one-dimensional, unquote, society where even radicalism becomes firmly integrated into the status quo and dissolves into powerless rhetoric and aimless gestures of despair. All this stands in marked contrast to the outlook of the Praxis Marxists in 1968. The 1968 Korčula Summer School was a truly remarkable event, calling together radical Marxists from all parts of Europe to examine what seemed at the time to be the beginning of a new revolutionary upsurge, encompassing both Western and Eastern Europe, as well as the United States. Bloch and Marcuse addressed the meeting, the latter appearing to modify his theses on the revolutionary potential of the working class, perhaps not a little surprised by the broad support shown by French workers for the students in Paris and the initiative which the workers took in demanding workers' self-management in the factories. Footnote, see Herbert Marcuse's article, The Realm of Freedom and the Realm of Necessity, a Reconsideration, published in Praxis in 1969. Stoyanovich devotes a special consideration to the events, the quote, events of May 1968 in the book Between Ideals and Reality, again, on this channel. And footnote. A flush of revolutionary enthusiasm was in the air, and it was given expression by the Praxis Marxists in their presentations. Supek declared triumphantly at the opening of the session that the, quote, workers' movement in Europe in fact shows, in the capitalist countries as well as in the socialist countries, that the socialist revolution is returning more and more to the line and framework of Marx's original anticipations, end quote. Rudy Supek. But this election was only short-lived. Even while these declarations were being made, Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Prague cast a dark shadow in the hopes of the Marxists assembled in Korčula to celebrate the promising events of the preceding months. Czechoslovakia, where before the occupation, in Supek's words, quote, Yugoslav philosophers and sociologists felt more at home than anywhere else, even including their own country, end quote. Supek had been turned into an armed camp, and in this development, Supek saw somber omens of what he feared was a, quote, new stage of socialism, end quote. Rudy Supek. The participants of the Korčula Summer School addressed appeals to world opinion deploring these events and sent a personal telegram to Tito urging him to bring his great influence to bear. And in an ominous indication of things to come, the Hungarian delegation to Korčula, headed by Lukash's brilliant student Agnes Heller, sent a separate telegram of protest to János Kadar, and returned home only to find several reprimands in store for each of them. Less than 6 years later, when the campaign in Yugoslavia to remove all Praxis influence from Belgrade University was just beginning to gain real momentum, These courageous Hungarian philosophers had already found themselves expelled from their university positions and unable to disseminate their views in public. Within Yugoslavia, the somewhat delayed repression of June 1968 student movement served only further to demonstrate to the Praxis Marxists that the existing institutions of socialist society were incapable of serving as vehicles of meaningful social change by subjecting themselves to revolutionary modification from below. This theme began to appear with increasing regularity in Praxis essays such as the young Nebojša Popov's discussions of the relationship of the working class to official institutions of self-management. Popov interpreted the steadily increasing incidence of strikes in Yugoslavia since 1958 as a sign of a widening gap between workers and their representative institutions, noting in its connection the recent emergence of several wildcat strikes accompanied by the, quote, self-organization, end quote, of the workers, independent of formally established institutions. He decisively rejected the sophistic line of reasoning that such strikes cannot be of a class character since they take place within a society in which the working class allegedly maintains dominance, and that therefore the very idea of a strike is absurd in such a society since the working class cannot strike against itself. Footnote. Here Popov directed his fire specifically at Zupanov's dismissal of the class nature of social conflict in Yugoslavia. End footnote. Still, it is to be noted that the strikes analyzed by Popov, including the student strikes, were no more than poorly organized, isolated outbursts whose effectiveness was further impaired by the atomization of broad working-class consciousness so deplored by other Praxis thinkers such as Supek and Kongrega. Indeed, Kongrega has pointed out only somewhat facetiously that at present there are 6 working classes in Yugoslavia rather than 1. In a more serious vein, he has lamented that the most that has been accomplished by the existing institutions has been to generate a fragile, quote, self-management consciousness, end quote, without, however, substantive evidence of even the promise of approximating self-management in practice, end quote. Also, not end quote. There's a footnote here. Never mind, no footnote. No footnote, no end quote. And it was in the decline of the Yugoslav working class's ability to control its own destiny in the face of hostile economic and bureaucratic forces that the Praxis Marxists found the ultimate tragedy in the present state of affairs. Markovitch lamented that, quote, at this moment it is impossible to perceive the identity of those social forces who will diminish existing class inequalities, eliminate the monopoly of power, ensure the power of the workers' councils from the level of the enterprise to that of the federation, and create anew the spirit of brotherhood and solidarity which was destroyed just when it had seemed that its moment of historical triumph was at hand. End quote. Markovitch. Perhaps this picture, drawn, it is true, in the early 1970s when tensions were beginning to surface, which would only a few years later culminate in the expulsion of Markovitch and his colleagues from Belgrade University and the closing of Praxis itself, is unwarrantedly discouraging. One of the central features of Marx's critical method, it will be recalled, was its ability to penetrate the surface appearances of existing civil society and to find in that same society signs of tendencies presaging new and more human modes of social interaction. It is perhaps with this in mind that Kongrega has spoken of the development of a, quote, self-management consciousness, end quote, not in the negative sense of the failure of reality to mesh with ideals, but in the positive sense that these ideals may become truly meaningful and urgent to the Yugoslav working class, rather than being proclaimed loudly from above and falling only on deaf ears. That these aspirations have been formed by the interaction of the workers with institutions of worker self-management, and by the reaction to the inadequacies of these institutions, may itself be seen as an indication of a hidden positive potential which may yet one day rise to the surface. In the same sense, Popov's observations about the alienation of the Yugoslav working class from its institutions and its response in the form of strikes may well have been a secret source of encouragement for him. Indeed, he wrote elsewhere, quote, "A gloomy picture of human life in contemporary society can be quote, a gloomy picture of human life in contemporary society can be a peculiar kind of ideology, insofar as one fails to examine the concrete, historically determined nature of the given state of affairs, and the open possibilities of changing it," end quote. Congrega concurred, adding, quote, "Only public and argued, resolute and militant Marxist criticism can liberate minds from the nightmare which daily oppresses people and sends them into apathy and resignation, or privatization, or confusion and disorientation, which then operates to the advantage of politicians and manipulators of all calibers, bracket, who seek to, and bracket, impose themselves upon the society in all areas of social life," end quote. Popov. Wait, no, hold on. Milan Congrega. For all this, however, one cannot help thinking that while a methodological optimism may be appropriate to Marxian social analysis, the Praxis Marxists might have been somewhat better prepared for the travails that lay ahead had they embraced a healthy pessimism to guide them in their dealings with the world of political realities. By the time Praxis entered into its final, although prolonged, confrontation with the authorities, it had been in existence for over 6 years. During that time, it had managed to establish itself as a uniquely respectable public forum for the sort of Marxist criticism which Congrega described in the above-quoted passage, a dissident forum which seemed to have a remarkable capacity for withstanding hostile confrontations with the authorities in the face of formidable odds. But as the writings of the Praxis Marxists, assuming ever more provocative tones, probed ever more deeply into the workings of an increasingly disturbed Yugoslav society, they would find to their frustration that their forum had not been built upon the most stable of foundations. And that's the end of Chapter 4 of Praxis, Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia by Gerson S. Sher. Chapter 5, the next chapter, is titled The Praxis of Praxis.